everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you this morning. Really excited for the next couple of days. Just to get us started, I want to do something a little interactive and just get a show of hands of how many people in this room in the last couple of years have received information from a loved one that you were like, this is kind of inaccurate. Okay. And then how many of you were like, ooh, let me try to intervene or do something about it? Okay. So one of the things I think that really brings us collectively in this room, right, is the ways that mis and disinformation have impacted us in personal ways. And along with that, right, is that we also see a connection between information, belief, and action, right? So it's from the information that someone is receiving, how does that impact whether or not they get vaccinated? Will they go out to vote, right? Like, how will they vote? Are they becoming indoctrinated, right, into some forms of racist ideology? And on the other, right, there's like a hope that through some kind of change or intervention, we can change either the distributions, right, or maybe the content and what people are consuming, and that can also change belief, action, and potentially lead to larger scale change. I think beyond also the personal, something that also brings us together, right, is the kind of transnational scale of when we start thinking about information and harms, right? Like we're here at a global summit. And so I think something, right, that we've thought about mis and disinformation is its relationships to how people have thought about governance, disparity, right? And also its connection, right, to kind of mass atrocities in different places. And so I think when we think about mis and disinformation, there's a kind of work that we have to do in coming to different shared definitions, right? They've also become some kind of messy and ambiguous terms that are often used to diagnose a variety of social problems. And so on the one hand, we've seen the connection with it to how people have talked about electoral outcomes, right? Pandemic responses. But on the other, right, if we think a little bit more, again, to the everyday, we have also seen the uses of information in different harmful circumstances, right? And that can include the lies that a landlord might tell lower income tenants to displace them from their homes to build luxury housing, right? We can think about the kind of day-to-day kinds of like crime coverage and like narratives around criminal history that justify, right, racialized tropes and legitimize different forms of violence against communities. And so, right, the kind of problems that we're experiencing now are not new ones, but draw on histories of inequality and the ways, right, there have always been deeper myths and narratives that have existed to justify, right, racial and economic forms of disenfranchisement. And so often when I'm thinking about mis and disinformation, I'm thinking about power and politics, right? And often what we discern as what is true or false is also about applying our political lines, commitments, and values. And I know some of you might be like, ugh, politics really got us into this mess in the first place, right? The polarization of information. But I think what's really important to think about, right, is actually what I mean by politics is this kind of vision of the world that we're struggling towards and the world that we want to have together, and also the kind of world, right, that really also addresses some of these root causes of harm and violence and inequality that exist in the present, right? We cannot disconnect the fact, right, that when mis and disinformation entered the kind of public sphere, it has been tied to a resurgence, right, of ethno-nationalisms and white supremacy, not only here in the US, but also globally, right? And that people are reckoning with that, and this, again, builds on different histories of violence that have also been sanctioned by different institutions. And so knowledge production has always served particular interests, right? And what is considered common knowledge and truth is something that people have always struggled over. And so I'll offer you an example from the COVID-19 vaccine, right? I think on the one hand, it has seemed like a really simple disease prevention and harm reduction tool at very low risk to most people. And at the same time, we've really seen the ways that it has polarized people, right? That also reveals different fractures on how we collectively as a society think about health and safety, right? What does care for immunocompromised people look like? And so I think when we think about like how history and politics helps us illuminate, right, some of these other broader issues around information, we can look, for example, the ways that actually institutional distrust, right, has been tied to different histories of institutional neglect, harm, and mismanagement. You have the long history of racial and colonial violence in the eugenics movement and forced sterilization, right, where the uses of science and medicine has been used to deem, right, like who is quote unquote fit to live. You have different histories, right, of the uses of public health to justify different forms of state violence, from the burning of Honolulu's Chinatown during an outbreak of plague by the Board of Health, to the detention of Haitian refugees in the early 90s because of fears that they were all carriers of HIV. You have histories, right, of the kind of testing and data harvesting of communities often racialized as quote unquote underdeveloped without consent, right, like the kind of birth control trials in Puerto Rico. And so all of these different examples, right, offer us a kind of glimpse into why there might be intergenerational distrust. And also, right, that these stories play out today in terms of stark lines of how people tell stories of who is getting equipment allocation, who is receiving pain relief in hospitals, right? And so I think that's like one way that we can look at this. Another thing that the vaccine has also illuminated, right, are also the kind of contemporary and historical geopolitical tensions, right? Some people have hesitated around the vaccine because of their perceptions of what governments or nations are the distributors or manufacturers. Right, like other people might also have institutional distrust because of their own lived encounters with forms of government surveillance, policing, right, data collection, also, right, like if they have precarious immigration status, certain fears of what implications, right, and encounters with institutions might do in terms of detention and deportation. And these are not like true cause and effect links, right? Like getting vaccinated doesn't mean that this will happen to someone, but they play on people's real lived fears and precarities, right? And how they exist vis-a-vis the state in an everyday way. And I think finally, when we also think about the vaccine, right, what it has also illuminated is a real lack of adequate language translation and interpretation of social services, including, right, like how actually difficult to comprehend billing, insurance, and payment services are for people, but also, right, when there is information, it isn't reaching people in the actual channels and venues and mediums that they consume on a day-to-day, which leaves voids, right, of information that can be readily exploited by other actors. And so I bring all of this up because I think, right, when we start thinking about information, this is not the problem of individual responsibility, right, to get better information or to get good information, but how we think about intersecting structural harms. And it becomes really important for us to begin to come to shared analyses, right, of like what have been some of the root problems. And I think those questions often seem like they exceed the scope of mis and disinformation, but I think really bring us to how information has always been bound up in social, economic, and political systems and structures, right? And so again, our information problems today are not just technological ones, right? We aren't going to be able to fact check or innovate nor police away racism, right, and information harms from our digital spaces. And so what we really need to understand is that we need to analyze power at local and transnational scales, and also in the context of which people live them, right, in order to actually address these different histories of harm. And I'll offer some examples of how this plays out from my own political position in Asian American communities, right? And so, for example, when we start thinking about how we understand root problems in the context of history, right, and the local and the transnational, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen, right, a lot of racialized information about the virus as Asian, right, that actually has built on long histories and media narratives and propaganda, right, of Asian people as dirty, as deviant, right, and always caught up in a kind of perpetual enemy framing, right, as the US has also engaged in different wars in and out of Asia, right? And so understanding this kind of present moment means also understanding this history of how domestic, right, forms of xenophobia and racism has also been a transnational story of US militarism in Asia in different ways. I think another thing that we can think about how we think about power is how it actually applies, right, in different spaces. And so for many technological platforms, right, often we're thinking about US-based for-profit platforms becoming police, judge, and jury of online violence, but they don't actually have a nuanced analysis, right, of power and context. And so this can also end up further marginalizing and harming people who are already oppressed. And so, for example, in India, you saw the Sikh farmers' protests, right? So a religious minoritized group, and a lot of the activists were targeted, right? Content about the protests and the hashtags were deemed as separatist activity and then removed and deplatformed from a lot of social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. You also have Dalit and caste oppressed activists, right, trying to make critiques of age-old hierarchies, and that is getting flagged as hate speech. And so throughout history, we've seen the ways that critiques, right, of institutions by different grassroots organizers have been deemed, right, as threatening or as terrorist activity. In the US, you have the history of COINTELPRO, right, and the targeting of Black, Latinx, Native, and Asian movements in the 60s, right, the kind of creation of the Black identity extremist tag, like in recent Black Lives Matter movements. After 9/11, right, the targeting of Arab and Muslim organizations as terrorist organizations. Right? And so we really have to think about power and how we analyze it. And finally, I think, right, when we think about power and how we analyze power, this comes up when we start thinking about how we build consensus in our communities. And so, for example, right, like a lot of historical traumas and experiences, we've seen them be weaponized, right, and exploited in ways to actually further racist and nationalistic interests. And so, for example, right, in June, we are about to see a very historic vote around affirmative action. And in some Asian communities, right, there have been anti-poor and anti-Black narratives around meritocracy and qualification, right, to justify the erosion of access to higher education, right, and create wedges. And so how we also need to organize and build consensus around that. And so really what is at stake, it seems, for many of us in this room, right, is that we are thinking about the futures of democracy, right? That's something that has already come up in this morning. But I think what we have to remember is our current democracies, right, have also been underwritten by different histories of racial and colonial violence. And so there's still a vision of democracy that we are continuing to struggle towards, right? And so we have to continue to ask ourselves, when we think about truth, right, and consensus, what we're also really talking about is what are our shared convictions, commitments, and values to a world that we want to live in, right? Like a world without racism, a world where people can access, right, affordable and accessible healthcare, right? And so these are all part of that bigger picture. And I really see this world as possible, right, in some of the ways that community groups are building different infrastructures, projects, and networks, right, often in the face of government neglect and harm, right? And so you've seen the ways that activists have also built community housing projects, right, mobile medical healthcare clinics. You see the ways that right now people are circulating information about gender-affirming health and also reproductive healthcare, right, as access to bodily autonomy becomes increasingly criminalized. And also, right, like there are a lot of different groups trying to do their own in-language translation work through the creation of help desks and hotlines to get their communities the information about social services and also civic processes, right, in the kind of channels and streams and languages that people need to get them at. And a lot of this work needs to be resourced more, right? Like we can't pour resources into kind of band-aid technological solutions, but really look to what is happening on the ground. And so where I'll close, right, is to think about when we start thinking about the future, what we really need to do is start reckoning, right, like with the different histories that have often placed, right, racialized people globally in different contexts of disenfranchisement, disposability, and displacement. And we need to reckon with that and again think towards the kind of world instead that we want to build for all people, right? So what is the world that we want to see and what is it that we need to do to build it together? So thank you so much. And it was so nice to be here with you all this morning.
Thank you so much, Rachel.